Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our webinar on tips for hiring and firing in a COVID world. I'm Jessica Forrest, Vice President of Accounts at Top of Mind, a public relations and marketing firm with clients consisting of real estate companies, law firms, financial institutions, hospitality groups, nonprofits, and other professional services. Through traditional media, social media, and e-marketing, our firm positions businesses as market leaders. And today, our panel of experts will share actionable information that you will be able to bring with you to your workplace. First, you will hear from Anna Lazarus, who is a labor and employment attorney with Lash Goldberg. She will then turn it over to Carrie Barron and Michael Strohmenger, founders and partners of Barron Strohmenger. Then you will hear from Sandy Jukel, who is a financial advisor and managing director with Ameriprise Financial. Following their presentations, we will then open it up for questions. So please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen to send us your questions. Now, without further ado, I will now turn it over to Anna.
Thanks. As Jessica said, I'm a labor and employment attorney at Lash Goldberg. A large part of my practice consists of representing employers in both litigation matters and advising with respect to policies or procedures. My take on hiring and firing during the time of COVID may seem a little bit counterintuitive, and that's because everything right now seems so different from how it was a year ago that we expect to see a different landscape when it comes to hiring and firing. But actually, a lot of the advice that I have for hiring and firing now is the same as it was in a non-COVID world. It's just become a lot easier to forget the basics and to accidentally step on a legal landmine. And here's an example of what I mean. Both Florida and federal law prohibit making employment decisions, including hiring and firing, based on somebody's membership in a protected class, like their age or sex, disability, pregnancy. So in normal times, you can't decide so-and-so can do the job, but they're just too old, let's get rid of them. You can't do that. But we hear all the time that coronavirus is more dangerous for people who are elderly or have underlying medical conditions. So it's very easy to imagine a well-meaning employer not wanting to put at risk somebody that they care about. They may even think they're doing an employee a favor by saying, stop working now. But just like in normal times, employers covered by federal or state, the Florida or federal Civil Rights Act, or if you're in a different state, chances are there's some comparable law in your state. You can't base employment decisions on those protected characteristics. There is an exception under federal law for medical conditions that would pose a direct threat to health or safety. That's a very high standard to meet and would be based on an individualized assessment. The general rule is you can't base decisions on somebody's disability or age, et cetera. Another example would be taking sex into account for an employment decision. Say, for instance, a male and female employee each have kids and schools go back to being fully virtual. An employer might think they would be doing a female employee a favor by allowing her extra flexibility to deal with things like homeschooling kids. Another way to look at that scenario would be giving her flexibility is just reinforcing the outdated notion that childcare is women's work. I've got an entire soapbox spiel about that, but for now, I will just say it's a good idea to guard against, benevolent employment decisions based on sex, something an employer might perceive as benevolent. So the main takeaway from my perspective is that while everything feels different right now, and there are some nuanced considerations for hiring and firing during the pandemic, employers will go far by remembering the basics and not forgetting all of the pre-COVID laws and considerations. One situation that is a little bit different might be if a business is bringing back a workforce that has been on furlough or that was laid off. If you're bringing employees back from a furlough, think through how you're going to do that. Do you want to bring everybody back at the same time, stagger returns based on the importance of the role? Do you want to conduct an anonymous survey to see who feels comfortable and wants to return? Take a look at who you've decided to bring back and just see if it looks discriminatory or if you're favoring one group over another. And remember too, that even if you're not consciously making decisions based on membership in a protected class, like age or disability, there can be a disparate impact. So if an employer, sets some facially neutral criterion for bringing people back, they may unintentionally treat one group more favorably than another. However employers go about bringing their workforce back, a primary concern is going to be keeping everybody safe. So before you reopen or go on a hiring spree, you'll want to think through, are you going to want to require COVID testing before an employee starts? The EEOC has advised that employers can require employees or future employees to be tested for COVID before they start work, but not antibody testing. That requiring antibody testing would violate the Americans with Disabilities Act, according to the EEOC. So you would also want to consider, are you going to require health screenings? If you do that, remember that health information needs to be kept separately from an employee's personnel file, and that's true during COVID times or, not. Also remember that the time that an employee spends being screened could well be compensable time, or even if not strictly speaking compensable time, it may be prudent just to pay it, rather than deal with somebody challenging the compensation decision. You'll also, of course, want to consider workplace rules like, are you going to require masks, or how many people can be in the break room at a time, things like that. Another consideration for hiring and bringing employees back is the Fair Labor Standards Act. So that's the law that requires overtime and minimum wage. The law has not changed, but compliance with it has become more difficult in the sense that people who have remote employees, it's much harder to keep track of everybody's hours. You still have to pay, for time and a half, over 40 hours for non-exempt employees. But the consideration that I would say for right now for hiring during COVID is this is a good opportunity to reassess each position. So if you're filling a position that's been vacant for a while, suppose you have traditionally classified this position as exempt. The employee would be exempt from overtime, so they would not be paid time and a half. To the extent the responsibilities have changed, now is a good time to update the job description and also reassess if you've properly classified the employee. If their responsibilities have changed and now this person has taken over a lot of responsibility for, cleaning the office, disinfecting, things like that, the employee may have become it may now be a non-exempt instead of exempt role, and you'll want to change your pay practices accordingly. If you are returning an employee from a furlough, it's not always clear if you're hiring this employee from scratch or if you're just returning the employee from a leave of absence. That can depend on factors like how long they were out, were they still getting benefits, or were they paid during the time they were away? And the answer to that issue affects how much onboarding or how much of the hiring process you need to complete, like whether you need to redo I-9 verification. But regardless of whether you are reactivating an employee or hiring a new employee, now would be a good time to emphasize or re-emphasize and retrain on your pre-COVID policies, plus any updates. Familiarity with workplace policies is perhaps even more important now than it was before. For example, I assume employers have an anti-harassment policy, and they should still have an anti-harassment policy. And that policy should apply even if your workforce is working remotely. I suspect that right now, when people are not generally, walking down the hall and having conversations with their coworkers, they're probably putting a lot more in writing over emails and texts than they were before. And I suspect down the road, we will see in litigation some emails that employers really wish their employees had not sent. So it would be a good idea to take the opportunity to brush up on what's appropriate for the workplace and what's not, and remind people that just because they're not physically in the office doesn't mean that harassment ceases to exist. They still need to be cognizant of those policies. Also remember, for new employees, if somebody is starting a job virtually, or if they're starting to go physically into a workplace, but their coworkers are working remotely, it's going to be very hard for them to feel like they're part of a team and feel engaged. It would be very easy for such an employee to become disgruntled or disillusioned with the job because they just don't feel connected. And so it would be worthwhile, I would suggest, to make a little extra effort to introduce these new employees, make them feel connected. That's not so much a legal tip, but just a way to, avoid dissatisfaction with the job. On the other end of the spectrum, I'll move on to firing. Like hiring, all of the pre-COVID considerations will still apply. So as always, employers should be able to articulate the reason for their termination decisions, and they should document those decisions so it's clear the termination wasn't based on something that's prohibited. For example, an employee who may have asked for a workplace accommodation, let's say, that employee is not immune from termination, but an employer could not lawfully terminate them because they made a request for an accommodation. So an employer should be prepared to defend their decisions. Also, as always, employers conducting multiple layoffs or terminations should conduct an adverse impact analysis with the assistance of counsel so that this stays privileged. For example, if women make up 40% of the workforce, but they are 60% of the layoff group, that could prompt a claim that sex played a role in the selection of employees to lay off. It doesn't mean the layoff is impermissible or improper. It may be just fine, but the employer should be prepared to explain how that disparity arose and what the neutral criteria was that they used to select the employees. Relatedly, if there is a group layoff accompanied by a separation agreement, so let's say the employer offers to pay severance in exchange for a release of claims from the employee, there are certain disclosures that need to be made under the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. And it is very tricky to figure out exactly which disclosures need to be made and to whom. The regulations on that are particularly, I would say poorly drafted. So that's a good area to consult counsel if you are doing a large layoff. Finally, the last point I'll mention is the WARN Act, which is the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. That applies to employers who are conducting a large-scale reduction in force or a closure of their operations. It applies to employers with 100 or more full-time employees if they are laying off 50 or more employees at a single site, or I should correct that, not just laying off. It could be if they are separating, if employees are taking a leave for at least 6 months, or if they have a sufficient reduction in hours for a large portion of their workforce. Those employers would need to provide 60 days notice before the operations shut down. And again, that's a good place to consult counsel if you are planning a significant reduction in force. I think I have probably used more of my time than I was allotted, and so I will turn it over to Carrie Barron and Michael Strohmenger.
Thank you so much, Anna. It is very much a pleasure to be here today, and a big thank you to Top of Mind PR. I believe this is our 4th webinar since COVID. So thank you very much for joining with me and my business partner, Michael Strohmenger. And we are going to be presenting on the tax side of things for hiring and firing in a COVID world. So I have a little PowerPoint for you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and do a share screen. So you can see, first of all, if anyone has any questions or wants to connect with us after the webinar, my contact, Michael's contact, our emails. So we like to be very easily reached. And I'd start with a very friendly, quick reminder of the difference between 1099 and W-2. It is relevant. And if you are 1099, that means you are an independent contractor. You're getting a 1099 miss to show that income, which is going to report determinable amounts of income. So if you look at that form, you'll see box 1 is for rents, box 2 is for legal. And generally speaking, there's a box for non-employee compensation, because that's exactly what this is. It's someone who is not an employee being compensated. So they'll get a 1099. A W-2, by comparison, is for an actual employee, meaning there's going to be FICA Futa Suta, or federal taxes taken out. And if you have, if you're in a state where there is state taxes, many of us are in Florida, one of 7 states in the country without state tax. And if that's the case, then those taxes will show up on your W-2 form itself. And I bring that up because of how it relates to PPP. This is a really big thing on everybody's mind right now, especially because many of you are now applying for PPP forgiveness. And I want to show you some of the forms for this in advance, because they do already exist. And for most of our clients, we're actually advising that you wait as long as possible to apply for forgiveness, partially because the rules on PPP have changed so many times. And it seems like now they are getting more and more easy as we wait. So I want to show you the 2 main forms, what that looks like, so you know in advance. And remember, these are forms that are going to the lender, which is generally going to be your bank. These are not going to the SBA themselves. These are for SBA provider banks. And essentially, one of the big things that they're looking for is to make sure that you are maintaining your salary levels and all of your payroll before COVID and after COVID. So look at what this looks like. Here's the first form. This is a little snippet, and this is actually a really short form of form 3508S. And 3508S, if you look at the top of it, it's going to say, a borrower may use this form only if you received a PPP loan of $50,000 or less. And look what it asks you. Employees at the time of your loan application, employees at the time of your forgiveness application. It wants to see a before and it wants to see an after. And even in the second form, it looks very similar. Here is the 3508EZ. And in this one, notice, see that on the bottom of this, it says, if borrower, together with affiliates, if applicable, receive PPP loans in excess of 2 million, check here. That's the form for over 2 million in the aggregate. And you'll see it also has a little mention of that on the top of this guy. A borrower together with its affiliates receive PPP loans totaling 2 million or greater cannot use this form. So please just keep in mind what threshold you are in when filling this out. But at the end of the day, look, it's asking the same thing. Employees when you originally did the loan application, employees when you are doing the forgiveness application, before, after. And I take the time also to remind you guys about unemployment, because unemployment, first of all, is taxable. If you have unemployment, you may want to consider withholding. That is an option if you receive unemployment. And just fun reminders, if we have cause for termination, no unemployment is required. No cause, they will receive unemployment. And just some friendly reminders, keep in mind that anyone facing COVID can take time off work and can't be terminated if they're missing work to keep the safety of the people around them. So really important to know right now. And then anyone who's impacted by COVID might qualify for additional unemployment benefits, workers' comp, or a period of paid or unpaid leave. So good to plan ahead for. COBRA. We speak about COBRA, which, if ever you were curious, the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1985. COBRA is going to be required for any employer with more than or equal to 20 employees. COBRA may be extending their timelines related to COVID-19, and from March 1st, through 60 days after COVID is declared over, that timeline would be eligible for an extension of your COBRA so that you're always going to be covered for health insurance. And I know that there's going to be a Q&A at the end, but this is my contact information. This is Michael's contact information. And with that, I will hand it over to Mr. Sandy Jukol. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandy Jukol. I'm a managing director with Ameriprise Financial. My office is located at 2 Alhambra Plaza, which is attached to the Hyatt Hotel in Coral Gables. Thank you for joining us today. Basically, I'm here to discuss how to navigate a job transition and issues you may face as the employer, and obviously maybe what you might want to discuss with your employees. And this can be employees that unfortunately, due to consolidation, they might be losing their job. And obviously on the other side, they might be, coming in. So usually what happens is the employer will bring in someone like myself, because a lot of these topics are very personal. And sometimes the employer doesn't want to get, too personal with somebody that, he or she might have to lay off, unfortunately, due to consolidation. So I break this up into 3 parts, how to navigate your job transition in these 3 parts. The first part is during your transition. The second is hopefully when you land a new job. And the third is maybe your action plan checklist. So the first one that I always talk to the employees about, and the employer should mention, is number 1, is there a severance package? If so, how much, how long? Because sometimes you have to put yourself in that employee's situation and see, what would happen to you if you were in that same situation. And I always try to have the employee mark down their potential income. If they're married or their significant other, their partner's income or their spouse's income. I also try to have them write down their unemployment benefits, their severance package, and then they have to go through what they're going to utilize and what they're going to have to look for, because obviously they're not going to have the same income coming in. They might have other income from, unfortunately, collecting unemployment or things of that nature, but they want to be able to mark down what their income is. In addition to that, what they want to do is they want to mark down their most important expenses. This is very important. Obviously, the 4 major things are groceries, rent, mortgage payment, a car payment, and insurance payment. Certain other expenses like cable, gym memberships, hobbies, entertainment, they all obviously can put on the back burner. That's why I come in and this is what I try to convey to them. Not that they're going to listen, but at least someone has talked to them about this. And I try to tell them to take care and take control of their finances. This is very important. They have to see, what they have and where they have it. Anything from their retirement accounts to if they're getting any rebates from Uncle Sam, so to speak, or what's going to happen with that. And the most important thing is they have to be able to manage their debt between their jobs. This is something that's hard for employers to talk to them about. That's why they usually bring in someone else to discuss it with he or she. But they want to determine how much money they owe. They want to be able to call their creditors in case they're having issues. They want to put away their credit cards and not utilize them maybe to the magnitude that they were before. They don't want to avoid making payments. They obviously want to be current. And if possible, they want to build a cash reserve if they don't have one already. And these are not easy things. Because of the CARES Act, at this juncture of time, they still can get relief from foreclosure. They have eviction relief. They have, credit reporting. Maybe the student loans can be put on the back burner. These are the kinds of things that the government is trying to aid with, but these are not permanent solutions. And then the major thing is the health insurance options. Are they going to have a COBRA plan? How long, can it last? And I try to explain it to them, that their elections usually for 60 days, the duration's up to 18 months, but these are things that the employer should go over with them. So the bottom line is that would be considered the first part. The next major part is what are they going to do with their retirement account? If they're the employee and they just got laid off, obviously they hopefully have high regards for their employer, but maybe not. But regardless, they're allowed to roll over their retirement account into a self-directed IRA. So most employees, not everybody, but most have 401k plans if they're working for a major employer. And in turn, they're allowed to self-direct into an IRA account of where they don't have to pay any taxes if they roll it over. A lot of times they can keep it in the employer's plan, but that's not necessarily what the employee likes to do. So the number one choice would be to roll it over into a retirement plan. And if they do that and the check's not made payable to them directly, then there's no 20% withholding. And the bottom line is that they can guide their own investments. And if they want a professional to help them, that's where somebody like myself would step in and help them. Other things that they want to be able to look for, and again, this is for a former or potential former employee or even somebody who's coming in as a new employee. That person wants to be able to know what their benefits are going to be. Are they going to have disability income insurance? Do they have health insurance? Do they offer a health savings account? The workplace retirement plan? Is there a group life insurance? You know, what is offered? So these are the kinds of things that one wants to know. And you want to be able to track your progress. Before you leave your old job, review your current benefits, take control of your finances, manage your debt, know your health insurance options, handle your retirement accounts with care. When you land a new job, review your new employer's benefits. Please stay motivated because hopefully this will happen. If you have a positive attitude, normally good things happen. And if you do decide that you need someone like myself or another financial professional, ask them to do a retirement checkup. These are things that are important. These are things that are easy to do for the future. And if you need any help, normally it's best to speak to a professional because these are the kinds of questions and topics that people like myself are trained to do. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our hostesses.
Thank you, Sandy, Anna, Carrie, and Michael. Now we're going to open it up for questions. So if you have any questions, please use the feature at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A feature. I already have some questions. Okay, so our first question, what is the employer-employee Social Security tax deferral?
All right, I think
that's a tax deferral that was passed as part of the CARES Act and additional notices given out by the IRS. Basically, an employer or the employee can opt to defer their payroll taxes. So there's withholding which they cannot opt out of, but there's Social Security and Medicare that they can opt out of, which comes out to 7.65% for each, the employer and the employee. They can defer that. For the employer, they can defer it from March 27th through December 31st of 2020. And by December 31st, 2021, they need to repay half of that amount. And by December 31st, 2022, they need to repay the other half. The same thing goes for the employee. The employee can opt out of their 7.65%, but they have to pay it back by anytime between January 1st, 2021 and April 30th, 2021. So it's a deferral, it's not an outright exemption. So you need to make sure that if you have deferred this, to know that you will owe this money back to the IRS at some point in the future.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Our next question is, what is the employee retention credit?
The employee retention credit. That is a credit that was part of the CARES Act as well. And the employer can get a credit for up to 50% of the first $10,000 of wages that are paid to an employee between March 12th, 2020 and January 1st, 2021. So that basically, if for any employee that makes at least $10,000 during this time period, the employer can receive a credit of $5,000 per employee. That's in addition to the PPP program. This is one of the ways that Congress has been trying to get employers to hold on to their own employees by giving them this potentially $5,000 credits for full-time employees.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question is it permissible to fire an employee who refuses to return to work in person?
I think that one's for me.
Yeah, that's for you.
I will give a lawyerly response and say it depends. If somebody requests to work from home, I would treat that as a request for an accommodation. When somebody makes a request for accommodations for a disability, the employer is to engage in what's called the interactive process. So the employer should ask, why do you need this? Or, how will telecommuting help you do your job? They're supposed to engage in a dialogue about that. The EEOC has said in guidance that a temporary shift to telework during the pandemic doesn't mean that an employer has to always accept all remote work requests. But I think one thing that the pandemic has taught us is that a lot of work can be done remotely. And, before the pandemic, I think a lot of employers were reluctant to approve requests to work from home or telecommute. And now I suspect it will be harder to defend the position that the work absolutely must be done in person. But if the work absolutely must be done in person, and there would be an undue hardship on the employer in accommodating a request to telecommute, then the employee cannot do the essential functions of the job. And so it would be permissible to replace that employee. But that is a very situation specific question. So you would have to go through the details of that particular situation.
Okay, thank you, Anna. May an employer ask an employee who is physically coming into the workplace whether they have a family member with COVID or symptoms?
I'll take that one as well. No, an employer may not ask if family, you may not ask about family members. GINA, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, prohibits asking medical questions about family members, but it is fair game to ask the employee if they've been exposed to COVID or if the employee, his or herself, has symptoms.
Okay, thank you. Sandy, I think this one's for you. Do I have to keep my retirement account at my old employer?
Normally, you are allowed to, but most people roll it over into what's called an individual retirement account that's self-directed. And what that means is normally in a 401k plan, although they can keep it there, it's sometimes better to roll it over to the IRA account where they can self-direct it because they have many more investment choices. Plus they're 100% in control of it. So the answer is they absolutely can roll it over.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is somebody asked how they contact you, Sandy. So maybe we could take a minute at the end for you to provide your contact information as well as you, Anna. So we'll move on to the next question. Did you, Carrie, this one's for you. Did you say an employer can terminate a W-2 employee for COVID? If so, is that termination with cause or non-cause? Maybe Anna should wait.
Good question.
That's probably more along the lines of a question for Anna, but
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Not an attorney, not giving legal advice. Disclaimer, that is Anna's field. But that being said,
I have not been engaged by any attendee.
Fair enough. That being said, if you go back, the PowerPoint that I just went through said may not be terminated or refused reinstatement if likely to infect coworkers. So there's a not there.
Okay.
Oh, oops, sorry.
All right, our next question. How do you go around, being more benevolent with women who do tend to be in charge of their kids' schooling, feeding, etc., without showing preferential treatment?
I would say be sure that you give all of the same options to men. So don't assume that in any particular family, the woman is going to do all of those things, homeschooling, etc. If you're going to offer, whatever sort of accommodation or flexibility to women, just be sure to make the same offer to men. And if a woman requests, if a woman approaches a manager or whoever and says, I'm having a hard time, I need this flexibility, there's no harm in granting that. Just be sure that you would treat a man making the same request the same way.
Thank you. Next question. Is the amount of PPP forgiveness affected if you have changed or downsized the amount of employees you have from when you originally applied for the loan?
Potentially. There's two tests that the IRS or the SBA is asking the lenders to look at. The first test is the amount of salary that was paid through a specified testing period, and then the number of employees that were employed during that testing period. And at the end of that testing period, you need to have the same amount of salary, you need to pay out at least 60% of that salary amount, but still have the same amount of employees as you did during the testing periods. So you can reduce their salaries, you just can't get rid of the employees. Otherwise, the amount that is going to be forgiven may be reduced.
That's actually a very good question. And part of the reason that I wanted to show you the actual forms that exist on that, if you look at the forms 3508EZ or form 3508S, both of those are available on the SBA website, or you can just Google them. But if you look, there is an actual formula to say what's the before and the after. But if you look on the forms, which I just think is very interesting, they're very general. So they'll ask employees when you first applied, employees when you're now doing the loan forgiveness. And the same thing on the other form, when you first applied, as you're doing the forgiveness. So take a look at the form in advance. It'll help so that you know how to fill it out and what exactly they're asking you to answer.
Great. Sandy, can you explain how you work with employers? Do you sign a year contract, or can you be engaged every time we need to let go an employee?
Yes, there is no contract. Usually the employer will call me up on the phone and I will come, obviously physically in person, wearing a mask at this juncture of time, or on a Zoom call, whatever is comfortable for that employer. And I will sit down with the employer and the employee, either or separately, and then discuss everything that I had just mentioned with them to make them feel at ease.
Great. If an employee ignores safety protocols and knowingly puts others at risk of COVID, what risk does the employer have against other employees taking some action against?
I think they meant.
Yeah, I think if an employee ignores safety protocols and knowingly puts others at risk of COVID, what risk does the employer have if other employees were to take action against the employer for knowingly putting them at risk? That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. So I think there are two scenarios where that could happen. One would be in the workplace, if an employee is refusing to wear a mask or doing something dangerous in the workplace, unless there's some request for an accommodation, like some religious objection to wearing a mask or something like that you would need to address separately. If the employee is refusing to follow the workplace rules, I think you go through the normal disciplinary procedures that the employer has. The much harder question, I think, is if you, for example, see a video on Facebook of an employee doing something dangerous, in a big crowd, nobody wearing masks, everybody yelling or something like that. That's a much thornier issue, dealing with an employee's off work, outside of work conduct. I would say, you don't jump to conclusions of, it's different if you're seeing a video of risky conduct, but, to the extent possible, don't jump to conclusions about what the employee is doing off of their work time. Be consistent. So don't take action against an employee for attending a Black Lives Matter rally, big crowd, no masks, if you would not also take the same action against an employee attending a religious event, same crowd, no masks, whatever. So be consistent. If you're sure that the employee is not following guidelines, I think it's fair for an employer to ask the employee to get tested or to quarantine and stay away from the workplace in order to, keep everybody safe. I hope that answers the question for what actions an employer could take.
Great. Karen, Michael, would you be available to help an employer apply for PPP forgiveness?
Sure. I don't think that's going to be an issue. It's just a matter of reviewing your documents that you have and telling you which pieces of information need to be provided in the forgiveness application.
Absolutely. And I took some time. If you look in the chat, I posted both my contact and Michael's contact and our direct numbers as well, so you can reach us.
Great. If an employer has to pay an employee that is positive, how would you recommend applying for the tax credit for 2 weeks of wages?
My understanding of this from speaking to people at both ADP and Paychecks is if you have them as your payroll provider, they will be requesting the tax credit on your 940 and 941s as they are filed. So if it's already been paid, I would potentially go back and refile that month or that quarter. And have your payroll provider take care of that for you.
Thanks, Michael. Any more questions? I think that's it. So before we close out, Anna and Sandy, do you want to provide your contact information?
Hi, this is Sandy. My contact information, my office phone number is 786-598-4477. And my address is at 2 Alhambra Plaza, Suite 750 in Coral Gables, Florida, 33134.
Happy to give my information as well. My phone number is 305-347-4040. Email alazarus, that's Lazarus, at Lash, Lash, Goldberg, Goldberg.com. And we are at 100 Southeast 2nd Street, Suite 1200 in Miami. That's in Miami Tower. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I just want to say that, we've recorded this and we'll send out the recording in a couple days to the attendees and people who couldn't attend. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.